Welcome to Kedem. I am very glad to be today again with Professor Michal Bar-Asher Siegal. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are currently filming in Tel Aviv University, but we caught you on a short visit from Yale.
Yes, I'm spending the year of my sabbatical at Yale University, and I'm happy that I got a chance to talk to you again.
Our last talk, which was aired on our channel, got a lot of attention from viewers, and the main thesis which you presented was that the Judaism and Christianity actually developed together alongside each other during quite a long period of time. Many of our viewers actually responded in a way that two separate religions, and this is the way it was actually from the beginning.
It's interesting that you mentioned all our comments because we had so many comments and so wonderful viewers that wrote to me via email in the comment section. It was really exciting. I have to say my favorite comment was that someone wrote Gal Gadot as a Talmudic scholar, which I really liked, by the way, so thank you for that comment. But you're right, there were a lot of comments asking about the basic assumption of the talk, whether Judaism and Christianity really maybe never even were one. There was no connection. They were always separated. What's the question about? So there were a lot of responses such as this. And you're right, we need examples for demonstrating my point that it was complicated and it was a process and it took time. You know what? Let me tell you a story. If I were to tell you about a holy man, a monk sitting alone in a cave, drinking water from a miraculous fountain created for him and a miraculous tree giving him all his food, not sleeping, not eating, concentrating on his own spiritual quest on his own in the deserts, performing miracles when he comes out of the cave, talking about spirituality and asceticism. You should, if you know history of the ancient time, connect it directly to the phenomenon of the ancient monks. When we're talking about late antiquity, we're talking about the 1st century CE. We know that the most popular religious movement of the time, really the celebrities of the ancient world, were holy men. And these holy men went into seclusion, caves. It starts around Egypt in the 3rd century or so, but spreads super fast. These are people who leave all their belonging behind, their family, their lives, and go and spend time on their own in meditation and spiritual quest, sometimes in small groups of monks, sometimes in larger, what we know as monasteries, and they are considered as holy men, being able to perform miracles, being able to reach certain spiritual levels. They're so popular that once this movement starts, it's everywhere. And not only is it everywhere, people start coming and visiting them. There's pilgrimage to come see them. They record what they say. We have sayings of them being recorded. And that these sayings, this holy man said so-and-so, is recorded in all languages of the ancient world. We have it in Greek, in Coptic, in Latin, we have it in Aramaic, we have it, so in all languages. And we know how popular they were. They were really the celebrities of the ancient world. Everyone wanted to see what they're saying, what they're talking about. When I tell you a story like that, right, about a guy going into a cave, living on his own, being able to perform miracles, talking to Elijah, you would think that this is a monastic story. You know what? This story is actually one of the most famous stories in the Babylonian Talmud and told about a rabbi called Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, or in short, Rashbi. And that story is extremely famous because that becomes the central piece of the Zohar, the book of the Zohar, which becomes really a very, very important book for Jewish culture in the development of the Kabbalah movement, all the way to Madonna and the craze of Kabbalah. And that centers around the figure of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his ability to perform miracles in that cave. What I want to do is basically talk to you about this story, go over the details, really go into how the Babylonian Talmud tells us about this holy man and what's the connection to contemporaneous Christian literature. And through that, I want to talk about your question. The Judaism and Christianity were really in touch with each other and were really in conversation about spirituality, asceticism, repentance, the study of the text, man and his God, man and his fellow people. So that's what I want to do today.
Okay, let's dive in.
Good. So let's talk about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai is a figure who lived, and that's the historical background we heard, during the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So we're talking about the first half of the 2nd century CE, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132, 135 CE. And we're talking about that time period. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we're told it lived in that time period. Now, the story we're talking about is not found in rabbinic sources from that time period, from that early time period. It's actually found in a later composition, the Babylonian Talmud, redacted not in the land of Israel at all, around the 6th or 7th century CE. So the story about him is found there and also in the Palestinian Talmud. Now, the Palestinian Talmud version, which is also later from the time of his life, is much shorter. We're only told that he hides in a cave. We don't know why he hides, what he does when he's there, how does he eat or drink. We only know that he's there, and then he comes out and he's able to purify a city, and he's able to perform miracles. When we move to the story in the Babylonian Talmud, something interesting happens. This guy, this holy man, this Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the story about him is much, much longer and much more developed. And there we find out, the Bavli tells us, the Babylonian Talmud tells us, why he went and hid in a cave. So he went and hid in a cave because he runs away from the Romans, which kind of a little bit makes sense historically. If there's a kernel of truth there, is that we know that during the Bar Kokhba revolt, we actually have findings of caves. You can actually visit them in the area of Jerusalem.
In fact, we have archaeological evidence for the fighters of Bar Kokhba hiding in the caves.
There we go. So you can actually go and crawl in caves, and a lot of sets of caves connected to one to another. So that kind of makes sense, and we know that this is a time period. But the Babylonian Talmud tells us that he questions the motives of the Romans in helping the Jews, and that's why the Romans are basically trying to catch him and kill him. So he hides in a cave with his son. And this is where our story begins. And the thing is that the Babylonian Talmud tells us that he hid in a cave and he only drank water from a miraculous fountain, and he had a tree of cherubs that gave him all his needs, everything he needed for sustenance. By the way, cherubs are extremely nutritious, but you will not be able to survive on it, so don't try it at home. But the story tells us this is what he ate and this is what they drank. And the story tells us that he and his son hid there for 12 years and then another year. We'll talk about this in a second. So he hides in this cave for 13 years, eating this water and this cherub, and also that both of them cover themselves in sand all the way to their heads. And why do they do that? Because every time they need to have clothes, if they're alone in a cave and they don't have a wife to sew their clothes when they get turned or something, they don't have any way to cover their private parts. So the story tells us that they keep their clothes, folded on the side, and 3 times a day they come out of the sand and they wear it and they pray. Now, the thing is that you have to imagine the picture, right? It's him and his son all day long, covered all the way to the end with sand, just their heads sticking out. It's literally talking heads, right? Like the name of the band. It's the image of spirituality. You don't have a body, you only have the heads. It's such a powerful image. So this is what they do. The story tells us, so they study all day long Torah, and 3 times a day they stop and they pray. They wear their clothes, they pray, and they go back. So after 12 years, remember, they're there because of the Romans. By the way, they're afraid that the wife, the mother, will tell on them. So that's why they hide. She doesn't know where they are. Can you imagine how she felt when she loses her husband and her son and when she doesn't know where they are? The story doesn't care about that, but I do. In any case, back to the cave. So they're in their cave, and after 12 years, we're told that Elijah comes and stands outside the cave. He doesn't go into the cave. He stands outside the cave, and he says, weirdly, he says, who will tell Bar Yochai that the emperor is dead and he's allowed to come out? He doesn't go in, he doesn't talk to them, but they hear it. They go out. So this is how they know that they're safe to go out. And the story tells us they come out and they see people working the fields. Now, all of a sudden, we're told that every person they see working the land, they burn with their eyes. They have the ability, actually we know that about the rabbis, they have the ability to burn things with their eyes. Magic, right? We know, by the way, the evil eye, the ability of the eye to do bad things. That's something that happens in a lot of cultures. I had a grandmother who believed in the evil eye, that, people feel that when someone looks at you because he's jealous or he's angry at you, there's something with the eye, right? So people in the ancient world believed, and in the modern world, of the ability of the evil eye. And this is actually a manifestation of it. They look at people working the land and they're very upset, very upset. So they use their eyes to burn. They burn the people, burn the field that they're working on. So everywhere they go, they're very upset, because what are they saying? And this is important. They say a sentence. How can they leave eternal life and choose temporal life? What did they mean? They just came out of the cave where they really lived the eternal life.
Yeah, so spiritual,
right? Yeah. Nobody, just the head.
And
remember?
they see people just working the fields.
To eat, like temporal life. How can they make that choice when they have that choice to make? It's like me, I don't understand why people don't want to all go to study Talmud in the university and choose to do other things, but they see the same thing, right? But I don't.
Indeed, that's strange.
Very strange, right? Strange. But I try not to burn anyone with my eyes. But in any case, so they go, right? So they go and they burn everyone. And then we're told that God is very upset. There's a heavenly voice that comes out and says, did you come to destroy my world? Go back to your cave, right? So they're sent back to the cave. And that's interesting, because that going back into the cave the second time is meant to use the cave as a punishment. It's literally said that there's a quote there, that the punishment of the evil one in Gehinnom, in hell, is for 12 months. So they go back for 12 months as a punishment. Also as a way to teach them to be, to teach them the value of working the land and the people, and we'll talk about that in a second. So they go back into the cave. And then after 12 months, they come out, and then the sun still burned people with their eyes. And then the story tells us that everything he destroyed, his father cures. And his father tells to him, you know what? You and I are enough for this world. Let them do whatever they want. So not exactly learning the lessons, but something happening here where the father is able to cure whatever his son does, and we're told that he learns a lesson. And then the story continues where they go out and they purify city from the dead, like in the Palestinian Talmud. That's not a section I want to talk about. So that story, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai and his ability to burn people with his eyes, right? And also be ascetic, right? Be in a cave, be a holy man, is taken as the basis. That figure of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai is taken as the basis for later composition in medieval time called the Zohar. And he's told to have abilities of spiritual nature, and that really leads to the movement of Kabbalah study, the basis of it. And that figure is leading to the fact that the cave of that rabbi is actually a site of pilgrimage until this day. This is actually the biggest pilgrimage site in Israel. People go up. It's more than a million people.
Thousands of people each year gathering in the
million,
even million,
coming to see his grave. This is like the largest pilgrimage site. So this is such an important figure, right?
Till this day.
Till this day. Such an important figure. Very Jewish, right? But what did we start with? And now I go back to my story. If you read the Talmud and the text that we're reading, about the written text, and you lift your head from the page of the Talmud and you look around, what's happening when this is being composed? We have a story that's told 100 years after it's supposedly happened, right? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai lived in the 2nd century. This story is found in the Babylonian Talmud, which is redacted in the 6th or 7th century. And we find that source there in a much more elaborate way than the Palestinian parallel. A lot of addition to the story. And these additions to the story, right, what he eats, what he does during the day, Elijah coming, the things he say about eternal life and temporal life, the use of the cave, all of this stuff is understood differently once looked at comparatively to what's happening in the non-Jewish world of the time. And this is what I want to talk about today. So when people ask me in emails and in comments over my previous lecture, and again, it gives me much joy to see that people engage with my scholarship, whether they like it or they don't, if they ask questions or not, it's still, we're talking about things that matter. they ask, how do you know that Jews and Christians were in conversation? And this is a good example, I think, for that. Because the story, go ahead, Alex.
If I would just hear this story without you mentioning that he is a rabbi, I would assume it's kind of monk.
There we go. Exactly. And the thing is, it's the other way around too. When people read this story about a rabbi and they didn't know anything about monks, again, he became this central rabbinic figure, no connection to Christianity. But what I try to claim is that if you read monastic literature of the monks, of the Christian monks, and the one about Rashbi side by side, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, all of a sudden something changes. You understand something. What do I understand? The literature of the monks, which is the most popular literature of the time. This is the equivalent of Harry Potter or, I don't know, like Jane Austen books. I'm trying to think what are the most popular books of the time. I think I'm a little bit too old to say something modern, but really, this is a bestseller of the time. Everyone reads stories about monks. They're everywhere. And we have this one story in the Talmud that talks about a guy who lived, again, 100 years earlier in a much later story. And that story gets developed, and there's a lot of details added to the story. And these details are familiar from the literature that was extremely popular of the time. So let's look a little bit about the Christian stories of the time, right? So when you look at the monks, right? So they live in caves. They're everywhere. And you start looking at stories that tells us about the beginning of this Christian movement of monks. So you ask, why are they in caves? So we see there's description of them running from persecution from the Romans. There's stories about running from women and their fear of betrayal of women, so very similar. And then we see stories such as Abathimati, for example, and others, where you see them running into the desert and then finding a cave, and you know what they find in caves, and this is story after story after story. You can actually see that structure, literary structure. They go into a cave and they see a miraculous tree and a miraculous fountain of water. And that gives them what they need. This is the first monks. This is before there were monasteries that take care of what you eat and what you drink. Very, very similar. In addition,
it's a construction which is quite standard for describing the monk, his detachment from the day-to-day life.
Exactly. And that is something that, all of a sudden you understand something, right? You read the literature, you read the story in the Talmud. It's not like any other story in the Talmud, but when you lift your head outside of the page of the Talmud and you look at Christian literature of the time, you're like, I know this story. By the way, this is what happens to me. This is how I found this story. I went to Yale University, wrote my PhD there. And when I was reading monastic literature, I'm like, wow, this sounds familiar. I know that story. I know it from my Talmud. So this is exactly it. And this is why it's important to study Judaism and Christianity side by side, because it really gives us another angle, a comparative angle, to put rabbinic literature in its wider non-Jewish context. So let's start. So we started with a cave, right? So they go into caves, there's a tree, and there's a miraculous fountain, right? Let's talk a little bit more about clothes. They sit in sand all the way to their heads. We have again and again repeatedly in the monastic stories that those monks, I don't know, there's a very famous scene in Life of Brian. Someone actually, by the way, in one of the comments of my previous video said, she referenced Monty Python. Yes, I will reference Monty Python again, because there's a scene there where he goes into the desert and he steps on this monk who haven't spoken in many years, and he's naked. And he has very long hairs covering his private parts. And so we have an occupation with that. So they live in a desert, they don't have any clothes, but we want them to be, covered. So how do you cover? So most of the stories tell us either they use leaves or they use their hair, right? So we have similar occupation in the story, right? Someone cared about this. They didn't care about this in the Palestinian Talmud, but in the Babylonian Talmud, because he knows all the stories, whoever composed that story is occupied with that. So he gives us another solution. They sit in sand all day. Yeah. Okay. So that's another one. But then let's talk about them leaving the cave, right? So why did they leave the cave? Because who comes to visit them? Elijah. So Elijah comes along, sends outside the cave, and he talks in general. Now, why does Elijah not go into the cave in the Talmud? Go in. Why are you standing outside? Now, what we know, this is where the monastic the familiarity with monastic Christian literature helps us out. Apparently, you were not allowed to go into the monk's dwelling. You were not allowed to go into the cave. This was their private spiritual domain. So we actually have stories of them standing outside yelling into the cave or reading letters into the cave. And the monk would choose whether to go in, to go out. You're not allowed to go in. So that kind of explains whoever composed the Talmudic story wanted to present Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai in a light that presents him as if he is a holy Christian man. Again, I'm going to say that again because that's an important point. You take the essence of the rabbinic story, a tradition about a rabbi hiding in a cave from Roman or in Bar Kokhba revolt, and you tell it later on in a way that's very familiar to everyone reading the stories, because their stories about holy men are everywhere. And you tell the story in a way that makes sense, right? I'm bringing you an example when I talk about things that make sense. I'm bringing an example from Monty Python and Harry Potter. I'm doing that too, right? And this is what they did. They told a story about a rabbi using literary motifs found in contemporaneous Christian literature. So when they're doing that, they bring in Elijah. And Elijah acts the way a visitor to a monk would act. And why Elijah? Why Elijah? What's interesting about Elijah? Now, Elijah, actually, this is what you need to know as well about monks. So Elijah was perceived as one of the archetype of the very first monks. Why? Because the Bible tells us that he lived in the desert, right? Remember, he's running away from the evil queen, and he goes into the desert. So he's considered actually, and he has magical powers, he can do miracles, he can burn people, right? So Elijah is actually perceived by the monks as the very first prototype of a holy man, a monk. So you see that again and again in stories, that Elijah is brought as an example. We follow Elijah's footsteps. We actually have a very famous here in Haifa in Israel, in the Mount Carmel, right? We have a monastery, the Carmelite monastery, the order of the Carmelite, of people following in the footsteps of Elijah, walking around in the Carmel mountain, right? So Elijah is focused. So if you would bring someone to visit Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, this holy man in his cave, it would be Elijah. They know, and by the way, Elijah appears in other rabbinic stories as well, so that's a good figure to bring in. Interestingly enough, and what kind of a little bit proved my point, in other stories, Elijah doesn't do what he does in this story. In other stories, usually when they bring in Elijah, he tells us stuff that we wouldn't know otherwise. He's telling us secrets from God or things that we wouldn't know otherwise. In this case, he's telling us something that everyone knows. The emperor is dead, he can come out. He fits the story because he is a monastic character. You bring him into the story. And he acts like a monk visitor, right?
Yeah,
he doesn't go into
nothing
the cave.
by accident there.
Nothing
It's
by
all
accident.
on purpose.
There we go. Someone created that story and portrayed Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, that historical figure, and retold the story in a way that uses very popular motifs from Christian literature. And one more example, and then we'll talk about what it means. What does it mean when we find this? And this is, we go back to the question of the parting of the ways, of Judaism and Christianity. That's the question we want to ask. But before we do that, remember when he comes out of the cave with his son? He looks at people working and he sees, how dare you, lose or choose
This way of living.
temporal life, right? You know what's interesting about life eternal and life temporal? We actually have that saying in Jesus in the Old Testament, but more importantly, in a story about holy men and monks. We actually have a story about a monk going to visit another monk on Mount Sinai. He goes to visit them and he goes to see the monasteries, and he looks at the monastery, and he goes around and he sees people working the land. And he gets very, very upset. And he says, how dare you choose life temporal over life eternal? And then the story continues. It's a funny story because the story then says, this Abba, the monk, hears him and he says, wow, and he sends him to a cell, an isolated cell with a book. So he goes there and he sits there, and then the time for dinner comes. He looks at his watch and no one comes to call him, and he's hungry. His belly starts rumbling.
No one is serving the dinner.
No one's come. So he comes out of the cell and he says, "Did you not eat today?" And everyone's like, "Yeah, we ate." And like, "Why didn't you call me?" And he's like, "Oh, do you really need life temporal? I thought you're a spiritual guy." So then the story basically is a funny one, right? Because it's meant to say, we need to eat. We make choices because we also need to eat. Choosing life eternal is nice when you have a miraculous fountain, a miraculous tree, but most people need to choose temporal life too. But look how interesting, how familiar this is. The cave, the cell, is used as a mechanism to teach the holy men of the importance of life temporal and life eternal. And this is what happens in the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai story. Because remember, at first the cave is a hiding place from the Roman. But in the middle of the story, when they go out and go back in, the cave changes its purpose. It's meant to make clear the purpose of ascetic life and how you treat people who don't choose the ascetic life. So this is a way to explain, the stay in the cave is a way to explain spirituality and people who don't choose that in the same terms. Life eternal, life temporal, and the same story, right? You go in, you see people work the land, you accuse them. Look how similar the stories are. And here I'm going to stop here for a second and talk about what it means. Right? We told the story. I try to say, try to show the similarities. By the way, what we did now is called comparative literature, or the study of the comparative religion. What we did is we compared, right? We took stories from monastic life and we took the Babylonian Talmud. And what I tried to show, look how familiar and similar it is. Notice the Talmud doesn't mention Christianity. The word Jesus is not mentioned. We talked about Jesus last time. This time, Jesus is not mentioned. Monks are not mentioned. Christianity is not mentioned. Nothing. Heresy, minim here. Nothing is mentioned. This is a very kosher story. It's a story about a rabbi, so kosher that it became, right, the epicenter of this movement, of the Kabbalah movement, of the Zohar movement. But if you read it side by side, the monk story, like we just did, I tried to say basically that whoever wrote this story used literary motifs from a very popular literature of the monks of the time. And they're retelling the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai using these motifs, and in fact, making Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai into holy man-like, into a Christian monk-like. Again, he studied Torah with his son, totally kosher, but the story is told as if he is a Christian monk, a holy man, right? So making him into a Talmudic rabbi. Interesting, but also look what it tells me as a historian. Remember, this is where we started off. Did Judaism and Christianity have contact? Did they know about each other? Did they influence each other? Can it tell us something about the development of both religion side by side? And my claim is, yes, it does. Look how much. Why? Because whoever told the story this way had to know the contemporaneous Christian literature. So much he had to know in order to create the story into the image of a Christian holy man. That doesn't happen if you don't know the Christian material. You have to know the stories about a cave and a water and the clothes and the life eternal, life temporal. All this stuff you have to know about Christian holy men and how they act.
Can we tell for sure if this is the Christianity influencing Judaism, or it could be actually the vice versa?
Oh, good question. Theoretically, yeah, it could go both ways, right? Could Judaism, whatever the monks saw, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, and became what it is. The reason we don't think that that's possible, or I don't think that's possible, is because of the quantity. We have one story in the Talmud that's told about a rabbi who lived a long time ago in the land of Israel. And we have, on the other side, a huge phenomenon starting from the 3rd century of monks living everywhere and people going to them and telling stories about them and actually reporting what they say in live. It seems much less likely that this individual story that's found in a much later source influenced the movement into making whatever. And it seems much more obvious to me that whoever is telling the story about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, who we have the more smaller, narrow, thin story in the Palestinian Talmud, takes the story and expands it using what's in the Christian material. And once we know that, that's the answer to your question, then look at the historical conclusion we reach. The historical conclusion we reach is that whoever composed the rabbinic story knew enough about Christianity to do that. That's a historical conclusion that's important. It's crucial. Jews and Christians knew a lot about each other. They were in conversation, so much so that they were able to create this story that's so similar to the monastic story. More than that, whoever created that story felt that he could tell that story this way. He didn't see that as a problem. He wasn't dealing with Christianity. He was dealing with the question of asceticism. He was dealing with the question of the study of Torah. He was dealing with the question of what we later see in Latin, ora and labora, Torah ve'avodah. How do you combine the study of the text and life temporal? We all do this, right? How much time do you spend studying and how much time do you spend earning money, right? We have to decide that tension that's always there in every spiritual community. Whoever's writing the story is dealing with that question, but he's using Christian material to ask that question about his rabbi in his own audience. So again, he knew enough about Christianity to do that, and he felt comfortable using literary motifs from holy Christian men to talk about rabbinic issues, about asceticism, about study versus labor. And so this is something that's historically significant. And this goes back to our main question. If I'm right, then it tells us that Jews and Christians were much more in conversation than we previously thought, number one. Number two, they felt comfortable discussing the other religion's point of view or literary structures or views or opinions. Number three, when I as a historian go look for the connection between Judaism and Christianity, to answer the question that your viewers, my viewers, were asking, when did Judaism and Christianity separated? When I'm looking for the answer, it's not necessarily in places that are overtly polemical. It's not in places when they say, Jesus said so and so and we don't agree, or Christianity said so and so and we disagree, or a heritage said so and so and disagree. This story, nothing. How do we find it? We start reading Christian literature. We read Christian literature, we read it side by side, rabbinic literature, and then we understand the world in which those two religions operated. And these worlds interacted and were in conversation with each other. And that makes the parting of the ways much more complicated. They were in conversation, they knew each other, sometimes they agreed. These are stories that they agree. They think about similar things. So, parting of the ways, yeah, but it was a long process in which they think about topics together. They use similar literary motifs. It influences each other. There is Christianity in the Talmud, and it's not obvious.
So you mentioned that this Babylonian Talmud was probably edited around the 6th, 7th century BC. So this is the time where this story was written? Was composed, edited?
I don't know. The problem with the Babylonian Talmud is that I know how late it was composed, 6th or 7th century. And I know that this is like the last timeline, right? The Islamic conquest or so, 7th century. But it has tradition, and this is kind of easy to show, going back to Josephus, right? Second Temple. So this is like 600 or 700 years of tradition. So what do you do with that? And this is where scholarship differs. Some scholars think that we can actually reconstruct Second Temple, traditions from the Talmud, or we can, when the Talmud tells us that the story is about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai from the 2nd century, so that story represents the 2nd century history. I do not agree with that. I think that the stories should be, at least the default assumption, should be dated as the redaction, and it could have earlier sources or earlier kernels to the story that go back. I don't know, Rashbi sitting in a cave. That could be a kernel of the story because we know of caves and Bar Kochva revolt or something. But from my experience, from everything I know about Jewish and Christian, so first monks lived starting from the 3rd and 4th century. So it has to be later than that. So it's not in the time of the 2nd century. It's from 3rd and 4th century, at least. From everything that I study, I kind of feel that the interaction with Christian literature has to happen in the later rather than the earlier period. That's kind of agreed by scholarship that in the first beginning, Christianity didn't bother the rabbi so much. It happens later on. So I don't know when it was composed. It has to be later than the 3rd, 4th century. I would say towards 4th, 5th, 6th century, but we just don't know when. I don't like dating rabbinic sources, but if I have to, I would put it rather on the late side rather than the earlier side.
Professor Bar-Asher Siegal, but what was actually the motivation behind this story? Why the editors or the authors of the Talmud would bring these Christian motifs into the Talmud? Why?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know why they did it. I just know they did. I can conjecture, I can guess why they would do it this way. And I would just use examples for myself, right? When I'm talking to you and explaining things, I use things from the world around me to explain. I use language, I use slang, I use cultural references to make what I want to say appealing, understandable, relatable to the audience. So I think this is a lot of what's happening, right? So they're using literary motifs from things that everyone knows, which is again important for historical purposes too, because then you have to assume that everyone knows. When I mentioned Harry Potter, I kind of assumed that your audience know what I'm talking about. I wouldn't use some, remote reference, so that we can learn about that too, right?
So that means that this story is widespread.
There we go. Yes, and again, historical importance, because it means that whoever composed the Talmud knows enough about
the Christian motifs and knows that everyone in his community aware of that.
Exactly. And that's a historical conclusion that's important for me, right? Because I want to ask, how much did Jews and Christians have in contact? Now we just reached this conclusion, which is, by the way, new and exciting. We didn't know about this. When, I'm fortunate enough that my scholarship, when I presented it, was accepted, by the scholarly community, but it's new. We didn't know about this before. This is exciting and new, and to find this out. So this is one. But let me take this one step further and say something a little bit more than that. I think there's a religious phenomena that's happening, holy men of the time. It's so important that a scholar named Peter Brown actually defines a period in history called Late Antiquity, the end of Antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages, and defined it as Late Antiquity. And one of its main characteristics is these holy men. So they're so important for that time period that this is what they are. They're a very important historical, sociological, theological phenomenon. They're so crucial. So when you look at the Talmud choice to take that phenomenon and bring it into the Talmud, I can't help thinking that they said, oh, we also have someone in a cave. We also had that figure, and trying to bring in and say, okay, so, they have their monks, they have their holy men. We want one of ours too. And through that figure, deal with questions that we want to deal with: work versus study, asceticism, repentance. And so they do this. They take this figure and they say, oh, we have one of ours too. This is what's called appropriation, or some kind of let's create our own kosher monk, a rabbi monk, right? A Christian monk found in the Talmud, but again, as a rabbi who studied Torah, by the way, becomes this. One last point. When the rabbi comes out of the cave, we kind of skip the end of the story, but when he comes out of the cave, his body is all filled with yucky wounds, and his skin is so bad that he goes into a bathing house. I think, as we're told, that his skin is so bad that when his son-in-law, is in the bathhouse and sees this, he's so traumatized. But how his skin looks, 13 years inside sand, not recommended. So he sees his skin, he's so sad, he starts crying. But then his tears, because they're salty, they hit the skin, the open skin, and they're salty. So you see Rashbi jumping, and he's like, it hurts him, right? It's a little bit funny, but it's also sad and traumatic. So he says to him, don't cry. I'm lucky you find me this way. I'm lucky to suffer this way. Why? Because it made me a better scholar of Talmud. If before I was able to ask 24 questions, now I'm able to answer double that, and I'm so much better scholar. What is that? we actually don't have in rabbinic literature the recommendation to suffer to be a better scholar. That's not local and doesn't found often in the Talmud. Where is it found very often?
Obviously in Christianity.
There we go. In monastic literature and asceticism, that idea that suffering will make you a better intellectual, that's very monastic. It's very, very appropriate for the time. So that idea is brought into the Talmud through the figure of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yohai, again, because Christianity of the time helps the rabbi think about ideas and concepts that they wouldn't otherwise do. So when you ask me why they do it, I think they wanted to think about those topics. And they have a very important and fundamental religious movement of the time. And they use it to tell a story that's relatable to their audience, but also to think about things that bother them too. And, think about the conclusion in very similar ways.
So we spoke about the importance of understanding the monastic stories for better understanding of Talmud. But can it be also in the different direction when we can use Talmud for better understanding of Christianity or of Eastern Christianity?
This is one of the exciting things about my research. And this is, I think, why I'm very fortunate to be in conversation with Christian studies scholars who are really very fascinating by my studies. I didn't think about this. I was focused on the Jewish study, and then I realized very early on in my research that indeed, understanding that the Talmud can be a resource for the study of the transmission of Christian traditions, the transmission of monastic tradition, and especially in that area of the Persian Empire in the East rather than the West, is a really exciting avenue for research. And I'm fortunate enough to really be invited and in conversation with scholars in Europe and in the United States who study those Christian periods in the East and in the West, and they want to know, what can the Talmud help us bring in a whole new slew of evidence for the transmission of tradition, the acceptance of them, the way they were understood. And again, this is why the study of religion contemporary in conversation and comparatively is crucial, not just for the better understanding of the Talmud, but also for the understanding of the relationship between religion and the understanding of early Christianity. So, good for everyone, and thereby should be done.
Professor Michal Bar-Asher Siegal, thank you very much for another great episode.
Thank you so much for having me.